Good afternoon. I'm Erin Mahan, the Chief Historian for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. On behalf of my office and all the DoD history programs, I welcome you to today's speaker event. It is a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Max Friedman is a rising star. I think I can now say he is a star in his field of diplomatic history. He's a professor at American University and specializes in 20th century U.S. foreign relations. He's the author of Nazis and Good Neighbors, the United States campaign against the Germans of Latin America in World War II. And he has co-edited Partisan Histories, the Past and Contemporary Global Politics. His most recent book is Rethinking Anti-Americanism, the History of an Exceptional Concept in American Foreign Relations. He was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2013-2014, and he won the 2014 American University Scholar Teacher of the Year Award. With that, I'll give the floor to Dr. Friedman.
Well, thank you, Erin and Shannon and colleagues for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy day to talk about U.S. relations with our oldest and most frustrating ally. There's sympathy for France right now in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, but it was not always thus. It's not so long ago that this building was consumed with planning for the invasion of Iraq, and France's president, Jacques Chirac, his high-profile opposition, along with the skepticism of his poetically gifted and beautifully coiffed foreign minister, Dominique de Villepin, led to a lot of renewed complaints about French anti-Americanism. Some of you, from the looks of it, will remember this quite well. From The Simpsons to the National Review, the French were cheese-eaten surrender monkeys. The Wall Street Journal drew Chirac as a transvestite and a pygmy Joan of Arc. Dinesh D'Souza urged Americans to ignore advice from men who carry handbags. Bumper stickers appeared reading Iraq first, then France. A best-selling book was published called Our Oldest Enemy, and jokes that alluded to French cowardice were told all over town. George Will liked this one. How many Frenchmen does it take to defend Paris? We don't know. It's never been tried. I laughed when I heard that one too, and then I stopped laughing. I thought about my visit to the military cemetery at Rancourt, final resting place for some of the more than 1,300,000 Frenchmen who died defending Paris in the First World War, or the 100,000 who died trying to defend Paris for 6 weeks against the Nazi Blitzkrieg in 1940, until after British forces withdrew across that 20-mile-wide tank trap known as the English Channel, the French lines were overrun, while we Americans remained neutral behind a protective ocean for another year and a half. This is why we often say in this business that where you stand depends on where you sit. And so today I'm going to try to give a sense of why the Franco-American alliance has been so tense, and to see what it looks like when we do the simple exercise of examining a bilateral relationship from both sides with a historical perspective. Now, the French were, of course, grateful for American intervention in both world wars, but not unconditionally so. French Premier Georges Clemenceau complained after World War I that his American counterpart was so preachy and self-assured that talking to Woodrow Wilson is like talking to Jesus Christ. After all, he added, your President Wilson has 14 points, why the Lord himself had only 10. And from the French perspective, Americans had helped win the war. But the 56,000 American dead did not begin to compare to their own sacrifice. The French High Commissioner to the United States, André Tardieu, put it this way. He argued that the Americans had mostly sat out the war. It lasted 52 months, of which the United States spent 32 in a state of neutrality and 12 in a state of what Tardieu called military abstention. That stage looked to us rather more like mobilization, training, and staging, but anyway. Then joined in only for the final 8 months of fighting. The fact that Americans had crossed an ocean to save France, and paid for their war too, did not resonate as strongly over there as it did over here, since the French assumed that we did it for our own interests. They focused on their own blood price and thought that that should cancel the debt. It was a similar story after the liberation in the Second World War, when President Charles de Gaulle praised the American army and then challenged one US initiative after another, especially in his second presidency in the late 50s and into the 60s. A very French combination of gratitude and skepticism that produced a very American response of outrage and disbelief. So it was in the more recent run-up to the Iraq War, when Jacques Chirac warned Americans, partly based on his country's experience fighting in Algeria, that the invasion would lead to a costly occupation and spark Arab uprisings throughout the Middle East. The reaction here was fierce and swift. Americans launched a boycott of French goods, burned French flags, and poured good French wine down the drain. The congressional cafeteria revised its menu to offer freedom fries, freedom dressing, and freedom toast. Members of Congress gave speeches saying that the bodies of dead Americans buried in Normandy should be dug up and brought home because French soil was no longer fit to be the last resting place of American heroes. Meanwhile, the largest worldwide demonstration in the history of humankind saw millions of people around the globe on every continent urge the United States not to begin a war whose necessity was hotly contested. Furious at the French and ignoring this outpouring of what we called anti-Americanism, most Americans united behind their president's decision as he ordered US troops to march off into the worst American foreign policy failure of the early 21st century. To an historian, this episode had the eerie quality of déjà vu. In the 1960s, French President Charles de Gaulle warned the United States against military intervention in Vietnam, basing his advice in part on French experience fighting in Indochina. And he predicted that a war would last 10 years and end in American defeat. The reaction here was fierce and swift. Americans burned French flags, launched a boycott of French goods, and poured good French wine down the drain. Members of Congress gave speeches saying the bodies of dead Americans buried in Normandy should be dug up and brought home because French soil was no longer fit to be the last resting place of American heroes. Anti-war demonstrations around the world were labeled anti-American events. Furious at the French and ignoring this outpouring of what we called anti-Americanism, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson ordered US troops to march off into the worst American foreign policy failure of the 20th century. I think there's a lesson here about the costs of placing stereotype ahead of analysis. American officials thought they knew why de Gaulle opposed the Vietnam War, and we know what they thought because their documents and tape recordings of their conversations have been declassified. Here's what they said. The French are psychotic. That's George Ball, Kennedy's Undersecretary of State. The French mind rebels at pragmatism. The Frenchman disassociates his thoughts from the facts. That's the Interagency Psychological Strategy Board. They put out some pretty vicious stuff out of Paris every day. I mean, these bastards just live off the fat of the land and spit on us every chance they get. Well, that, with apologies to any real Bostonians in the room, is President Kennedy. For leading US officials, friction arising in relations with France is largely due to the character of those damn French, as Eisenhower called them. Franklin Roosevelt called de Gaulle a nut and nicknamed him Joan of Arc. I don't like the son of a bitch, said Harry Truman, exclaiming that the French ought to be taken out and castrated. Secretary of State Dean Acheson found the French people as a whole to be mentally ill. So ascribing de Gaulle's actions to the irrational anti-Americanism of the French substituted for a dispassionate analysis of his broader foreign policy agenda. De Gaulle's overarching goal was the restoration of France as a great power, and his strategy had 4 parts. First, he sought for France the means to defend itself independently without having to rely on the United States, chiefly through the nuclear deterrent of a force de frappe. Second, he hoped to foster European unity through Franco-German rapprochement, ending the hostility between those two countries that had erupted into 3 devastating wars in less than a century. Third, he actively pursued détente with the communist powers a decade before Kissinger and Nixon did, by recognizing China and seeking to improve relations with the Soviet Union. His amorphous and in this country controversial formula of a Europe united, quote, from the Atlantic to the Urals, was, de Gaulle explained, not a pro-Moscow shift away from the Atlantic Alliance, but historical anticipation, a way to offer some hope to Eastern Europeans that they had not been forgotten, and showing the Russians that a European Union would not be directed against them. His understanding of international affairs emphasized nations, not ideologies. He did not believe in a monolithic communist threat, as some Americans did, but instead sought to exploit the Sino-Soviet split from an early year, and thought that 1,000 years of Vietnamese hostility to the Chinese meant that a Vietnam under communist rule could remain independent, like Joseph Tito's Yugoslavia. Finally, and this fourth element was neglected by Americans, de Gaulle's strategy included a significant opening to the developing world. That meant completing the withdrawal from Algeria to end France's status as a colonial power, and then offering developing countries French leadership and aid as an alternative to Cold War polarization between the Soviet Union and the United States. He invested a great deal in this, by the way, about 2.5% of GDP at a time when the US and Britain were spending about 1% on foreign aid. And this strategy would not only improve France's prestige on the world stage, de Gaulle hoped, but it could mean that the forces of nationalism unleashed in the newly decolonizing states in Africa and Asia, what Kennedy called the chief arena of the Cold War battle, which were then encountering skepticism in Washington, that these movements might not rush headlong into the open arms of the communist bloc and could turn to France instead. Well, that was his plan. Reality is another question. But seen in this light, de Gaulle's divergence from US policies becomes more intelligible, emerging not from pique or anger at the Americans, but as part of a different strategic vision. Americans thought US and French interests were congruent, and that France should therefore accept American leadership on all important questions. De Gaulle felt responsible for French interests first, and thought the two countries should cooperate wherever their interests were aligned, but in a two-way street. From 1958 onward, de Gaulle sought to become more than a junior partner. When Eisenhower sent 14,000 troops into Lebanon without telling the French, despite their historical interests there, de Gaulle complained. And when Eisenhower then considered using nuclear weapons against China over the disputed offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu, which could have unleashed a global conflict, de Gaulle called for a change. Rather than the existing NATO arrangement in which Americans led and Europeans followed, de Gaulle sought a strategic directorate within NATO of the three most important powers, the US, Britain, and France, one that would act in concert not only in Europe, but on international matters that could affect the security of all countries concerned. Eisenhower rebuffed the request. During Kennedy's visit to Paris in '61, de Gaulle again asked for consultation before any use of nuclear weapons, especially since, as he pointed out, those weapons were likely to be used in Europe. The American government was, unsurprisingly, not willing to cede control over its nuclear arsenal. The French viewed Kennedy's policy of flexible response with concern. Did it mean that the United States would meet a future Soviet invasion of Western Europe only with tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield, meaning widespread destruction inside France and Germany, but not use its strategic nuclear weapons, ICBMs, against Soviet territory in order to spare American cities from retaliation? De Gaulle explained that this is why the French needed an independent nuclear deterrent, asking, how can we French be certain if you are not bombed directly on United States soil, you would intervene in a way that would bring death down upon your heads? And he said to Kennedy, this isn't about you. There will be another president in 8 years. What will that person be like? It's not a question of trust. It's a question of the national interest. And he pointed to the example of the Second World War as a precedent that showed the French that Americans might not act until war touched them directly. Kennedy expressed frustration over Gaullist complaints. They either attack us for trying to dominate Europe, or they attack us for withdrawing from Europe, or that we won't use nuclear force, or that will get them into a war in which they're not consulted, Kennedy said exasperatedly. And he was right on all 4 points. De Gaulle's worry was that the Americans would not be willing to start a nuclear war when it was necessary to defend France, or a better way to express that is to take that posture in order to credibly deter an attack in Western Europe, but might start a nuclear war elsewhere, China, for example, over interests that were not vital from the French point of view. Hervé Alphand, who served for 10 years as France's ambassador in Washington, wrote that de Gaulle feared both American hegemony and withdrawal, which appears contradictory, but also can be concurrent. There were positions between the absolutes that de Gaulle thought more appropriate for a partnership. Well, despite these important differences on policy, de Gaulle insisted he was committed to the Atlantic Alliance, and he soon had the opportunity to prove his point when Khrushchev sent nuclear-armed missiles to Cuba. France provided an array of concrete assistance to the United States on Cuba that began before the crisis did, and most of it has been forgotten. He had already created a secret and lasting arrangement to provide Washington with same-day intelligence reports on Cuba, something of great value and hard to get in this country at that stage. The Foreign Ministry at the Quai d'Orsay in January 1961 instructed its Havana embassy to send duplicates of all its political dispatches directly to Washington without clearing them through Paris first. If you can imagine what that would be like in your own chain, in order to keep the Americans well informed. Since the U.S. Embassy was closed by then, this was one of the few remaining Western sources of information from inside Cuba, an arrangement, by the way, that carried substantial risks to the French carrying it out, who were under constant hostile surveillance by the Cubans. That information, moreover, was quite useful. Ambassador Robert de Gardier reported from Havana in August 62, that embassy officials traveling at night had seen a convoy of heavy trucks bearing missile launch ramps about a dozen meters long, and reported that at least 4,000 Slavic personnel had debarked from Soviet ships at the same time. That was a 2-month warning ahead of the missiles of October. And de Gaulle's personal reaction to the missile crisis when it broke also hardly fits the image of an irascible anti-American. Kennedy asked Dean Acheson to secretly carry the U-2 photos to Paris, and Acheson offered to show de Gaulle the photographic evidence. De Gaulle waved it away, saying something that today can make us a little wistful. A great nation like yours would not act if there was any doubt about the evidence, and therefore I accept what you tell me as a fact without any proof of any sort needed. De Gaulle followed up with an immediate order to the French mission at the UN to back the American position in the Security Council, whatever it might be. And he told the US ambassador that if things went badly in the crisis, Kennedy could count on France being at his side in the war. All of that made de Gaulle the firmest supporter of the United States in Europe during the crisis. Other allies were actually more worried. Nonetheless, French officials drew their own lessons from the episode. Ambassador Alphand noted that the crisis showed how determined the Americans were to act unilaterally in an emergency and to make decisions alone, even a decision that might start a war involving the Allies. By August 1963, de Gaulle was complaining to Alphand, "They never consult us." It's these kinds of existential questions, rather than pique or his personal treatment at the hands of Roosevelt when he was leading the Free French, that were the true sources of Franco-American tensions. Each decision was made not out of prejudice against the United States or desire to harm it, but with the question in mind that de Gaulle often interjected in order to settle long policy debates among his top advisors. What is the national interest? Still, the charge of anti-Americanism stuck, and it distorted US interpretations of a whole range of French policy decisions. When France extended diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China in 1964, we called it an act of anti-Americanism. The British, by the way, had recognized China 14 years earlier in order to protect their investments in Hong Kong, and nobody called that an act of anti-Americanism at the time. De Gaulle offered 3 rationales for his action: widening the Sino-Soviet split, pursuing French economic interests, and helping to resolve the Southeast Asian crisis. In Asia, he said, there can be neither war nor peace without China being involved. Shortly before his death, Jack Kennedy had told National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy that he too planned to recognize China in the second term. Johnson also would have liked to recognize China, but thought it was politically impossible. De Gaulle had merely done what these two US presidents wished they could have done, and what Richard Nixon, the only one of the three US presidents with no fear of being attacked by Richard Nixon for doing it, finally did. The same pattern applied to de Gaulle's decision to remove US troops from French soil. He believed that the presence of tens of thousands of foreign troops not under French command, even Allied ones, even from the liberators, was not in keeping with the principle of national sovereignty and independence. In March 1966, he withdrew France from NATO's integrated command structure and asked the Americans to withdraw their troops from France, telling his ministers and cabinet that the decision was the consequence of the repeated American failure to consult. We are not disposed to follow the Americans into all the adventures into which they deem it good to launch themselves. Well, Americans understood that act very differently. Secretary of State Dean Rusk was livid and asked de Gaulle bitterly, does that include the dead Americans in military cemeteries as well? Touché. Some US officials recognized that this was not the end of the West. Vice President Hubert Humphrey tried to explain in a television interview, France hasn't withdrawn from her participation in terms of the defensive structure of NATO. She has withdrawn the control of her troops from the NATO command, but she still has her 2 divisions in Germany, she still is a very powerful nation, and she still has her alliance with us and with other countries. For most Americans, however, it was merely another poke in Uncle Sam's eye from an ungrateful and exasperating Frenchman. Coupled with the so-called war on the dollar, Vive le Québec libre, and other gestures, the Americans united against de Gaulle. Anger reached the popular level. In New York, women returned French handbags to department stores. Entrepreneurs made money selling de Gaulle dartboards and voodoo dolls. And de Gaulle's reputation as an anti-American was sealed. Now, of all the points of friction, none angered American officials and the public so much as de Gaulle's criticism of the war in Vietnam. Traditional accounts, scholarly accounts, hold that de Gaulle tried to undermine the US effort in Southeast Asia as an act of prideful vengeance, hoping that the United States would not succeed where France had failed. But on closer examination, anti-Americanism as an explanation for French opposition to the Vietnam War turns out to be a red herring. And even worse, it was an analytical failure in real time that clouded American vision where both France and Vietnam were concerned, and it seems to have contributed to bad outcomes. De Gaulle's first public statement on Vietnam, a rather mild and ambiguous call for Vietnamese neutralization that made no mention of the United States, came in August 1963, and it produced fury in the White House. If he had objections, why didn't he state them privately? Clearly, this was another piece of his anti-American campaign. Kennedy said he does it to annoy us. What this ignored is that by the time of his first public August 1963 statement, de Gaulle had already been engaged for 2 years in quiet diplomacy, going public with sharper criticism only when the Americans dismissed his advice and escalated the war. The private warnings were numerous. In Paris in 1961, de Gaulle warned Kennedy personally on Indochina, citing France's own unhappy experience. I predict that you will sink step by step into a bottomless military and political quagmire. Instead, he recommended an international conference to negotiate the neutralization of Southeast Asia along the lines of the 1954 Geneva Accords that had brought France's war there to an end. De Gaulle passed the same warning to the US ambassador in Paris. Our own experience taught us, de Gaulle said, that foreign intervention will fail. I fear you are getting bogged down in a vain enterprise from which it will become more and more difficult to extract yourselves. Also in 1961, Ambassador Alphonse in Washington, under instructions, privately urged US officials 4 times not to send combat troops to Vietnam. Now, France, logically enough, after 80 years of colonial rule, retained the best contacts in Indochina of any Western power. 17,000 French citizens still lived in South Vietnam. Many Vietnamese exiles from many different political currents lived in Paris, where they were in touch with the Quai d'Orsay. I've dug deeply into the archival record in Paris, and it shows that French officials throughout the foreign policy bureaucracy, career diplomats, Gaullists, anti-Gaullists alike, were all in agreement with de Gaulle's assessment in Indochina. And so the French continued their warnings through 1962 and 63 to deaf ears. In May 1963, Foreign Minister Maurice Couve de Morville tried once again to explain the French point of view to Kennedy. There could be no military solution in Vietnam. The only path to peace would be the neutralization of Southeast Asia. Kennedy kept asking, "But why do you always give your policies an anti-American aspect?" And Couve replied that what Kennedy saw as anti-Americanism was either a divergence of interests or different views. Now, all of these exchanges took place privately and diplomatically before de Gaulle made his first public statement on Vietnam, and long before he began attacking US policy there directly. But none of that made any difference to top US officials who consistently ascribed French policy to de Gaulle's irrational anti-Americanism. McGeorge Bundy urged the president to simply ignore Nosy Charlie on Vietnam, and so they did. The State Department dismissed the advice of French officials as undoubtedly marked by the emotional experience of French defeat. The Joint Chiefs of Staff observed rather derisively, the French also tried to build the Panama Canal. In other words, the US would succeed where the French had failed. Faith in the dichotomy of French irrationality and American objectivity persisted at a time when de Gaulle was predicting that American escalation would bring 10 years of war, an almost perfectly accurate forecast, while Americans, presuming themselves to be completely free of any emotional influences on their own assessments, kept seeing light at the end of the tunnel. The dismissive American response was an unfortunate product of the assumption that de Gaulle's stance emerged from that inflexible anti-Americanism. But a few observers who were free of that particular assumption, many of whom had more international experience, saw the August 1963 statement in favor of neutralization rather differently. Walter Lippmann, for example, probably the leading foreign policy commentator in his time, was a rare American voice of support, writing with foresight, "If there is no settlement, such as General de Gaulle proposes, then a protracted and indecisive war of attrition is all that is left." Bernard Fall, the widely acclaimed, widely admired Franco-American journalist, a former resistance fighter against the Nazis and a Howard University scholar who was considered the West's best-informed student of contemporary Vietnam. Fall characterized the notion that the French wanted to get even with the United States as thoroughly simple-minded. Had de Gaulle truly been interested in damaging American prestige, Fall said, he would have wanted the Vietnam War to continue because it was so internationally unpopular and such a drain on American resources. Fall supported a negotiated settlement leading to neutralization and thought, on the basis of his knowledge of Vietnamese politics, that such a conclusion would be acceptable to all Vietnamese parties in both sides of Vietnam. The alternative of war, he wrote, was not in the US interest. He said, "The sight of heavily armed Americans being stymied by lightly armed peasants does perhaps more harm to American prestige than it would if the Americans were not there and those setbacks were not primarily American setbacks." Officials in Paris benefited from Fall's private counsel during his visits, at a time when Washington disdained him for following the crypto-communist line, and the FBI actually placed him under surveillance. The chief diplomatic correspondent of the Washington Post charged Fall himself with anti-American bias. An American diplomat warned simply, "You've got to watch Bernard Fall. Remember, he's French." Well, Fall was unable to persuade decision makers in his adopted hometown of Washington before he stepped on a mine and was killed while accompanying US troops in the Vietnamese jungle in 1967. American military leaders would come to have a different view of Fall after his death. American officers read him at West Point, Maybe some of you did. From John McCain to David Petraeus, they respected his books, which still line the shelves of some offices in this building, especially Street Without Joy. Colin Powell wrote in his memoirs that if President Kennedy or President Johnson had spent a quiet weekend at Camp David reading that perceptive book, they would have returned to the White House Monday morning and immediately started to figure out a way to extricate us from the quicksand of Vietnam. Americans did not listen to Fall at the time, but French officials did, which is one more factor explaining their diverging views. Now, I also don't have time today to get into this, but I read in the archives of the British and West German governments on Vietnam and found that internally, after 1962, and especially after 1964, both governments came to share the French analysis, but maintained an outward position of backing US policy. The British and the German positions of calculated insincerity, public statements of support, despite a private assessment that the war could not be won, and a marked preference for a negotiated settlement along the lines of de Gaulle's proposal. These were based almost entirely on their belief that the Americans were intolerant of criticism and that professions of support had become the price of good relations, especially under Johnson. The fact that all three major European powers reached similar conclusions about Vietnam refutes the interpretation that the French assessment must have been caused by the distortion of some particularly French version of anti-American pique. Indeed, one might well ask how pro-American it was to offer insincere support for an ally's self-destructive policy while in full expectation that it was doomed to fail. Well, if French advice couldn't prevent the war, French assistance proved vital to ending it. De Gaulle did more than simply offer Paris as the venue for peace talks. The French provided security and arranged secret contacts, helped to initiate meetings to keep the talks going. At one point, the Asia desk chief of the Quai d'Orsay, Etienne Manach, would hand carry messages back and forth between the Americans and the North Vietnamese when they wouldn't be in the same room. And the French were highly professional about this. Although the secret meetings they enabled, including between Kissinger and the North Vietnamese officials that lasted for years, these lasted for years, but there were no leaks from the French. As it turned out, reflected Dean Rusk, Paris proved to be very satisfactory as a site because President de Gaulle acted very correctly, and the French did everything they could to facilitate the talks. This was only one reason that Kissinger, who also admired de Gaulle's far-sighted and early pursuit of détente, wrote, "I believed then, as I believe now, that de Gaulle was extremely helpful to the Western world." So if some Americans have asked the question, was de Gaulle anti-American? I think we should be asking a different question. Did the assumption that French policy came from anti-Americanism hinder US officials from considering France's advice on Vietnam? I'll let the answer come not from me, but from an impeccable source, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Here's what he said looking back from the 1990s. McNamara here. "I believe we should have explored the idea of a neutral solution in Vietnam with the French. It is true that de Gaulle was difficult to deal with, but we didn't properly analyze the idea of a neutral solution. It wasn't taken seriously. It was simply rejected. And that, I believe, was a basic mistake, a failure of imagination." The imagination of top American officials failed in part because they could not conceive of the possibility that Vietnamese communists might be eager to avoid war and dependence on the Chinese and might have traded neutrality in the Cold War for peace. The failure of the imagination McNamara refers to also came because it was not possible then for Americans to conceive of the utility or even good faith of foreign criticism when that criticism came from the French. That's why it's so depressing to have watched another French president suffer the same fate. Jacques Chirac was the first foreign head of state to hurry to New York after September 11th and to stand at the side of my friend George at the White House. But while his pledge of solidarity included a willingness to fight America's attackers in Afghanistan, it did not extend to the planned invasion of Iraq. Be careful, Chirac urged Americans in an interview on CNN. Think twice before you do something which is not necessary and may be very dangerous. Like de Gaulle's initial warnings against escalation in Vietnam, Chirac had already begun with an earnest and discreet message. In a private conversation with Bush in Prague in November 2002, Chirac recalled his own service as a conscript in France's unsuccessful campaign to suppress Algerian rebels. He warned him of the force of Arab nationalism and the endemic violence that would accompany an occupation. Iraq, he pointed out, did not support al-Qaeda and was too weak to present an imminent danger. The Muslim world would view the intervention as illegitimate, thereby increasing rather than diminishing the pool of terrorist recruits. The best way to protect US and European cities, in the French view, was to pursue terrorists relentlessly, using investigative and judicial methods where appropriate, the same targeted techniques that had enabled Americans to arrest and convict the 1993 bombers of the World Trade Center, as well as the Millennium bomber Ahmed Ressam, arrested at the US-Canadian border en route to deliver a car bomb to Los Angeles when French intelligence tipped off the Canadians and the FBI. War against al-Qaeda was also legitimate, and France joined it. But, he argued, spreading the war to third countries and replicating colonial patterns of the past risked persuading too many of the world's Muslims that the West was at war with them. Well, those were the warnings from our oldest ally. Most Americans, obviously at that time, saw things differently. But instead of a dialogue, we got freedom fries. House Speaker Dennis Hastert called for sanctions on French goods. "I took the Grey Poupon out of my cupboard," boasted Congressman Duke Cunningham, unwittingly naming an American product manufactured by Kraft Foods. Condoleezza Rice famously said in response to the perfidy of countries opposing the Iraq War that the US should ignore Germany, forgive Russia, punish France. Chirac himself tried to explain his view of America, invoking his student days. "I've known the US for a long time," he told Time magazine. "I've studied there, worked as a forklift operator in Anheuser-Busch at St. Louis, and as a soda jerk at Howard Johnson's. I've hitchhiked across the whole United States. I know the US perhaps better than most French people, and I really like the United States. I've made many excellent friends there. I feel good there. When I hear people say that I'm anti-American, I'm sad. Not angry, but really sad." The source of his dispute with US officials, Chirac concluded, was that "I simply don't analyze the situation as they do. A war of this kind cannot help giving a big lift to terrorism. It would create a large number of little bin Ladens." Now, that he, like de Gaulle, turned out to have some foresight was cold comfort when American troops started getting killed on sandy roads by improvised weapons and bombs started going off in cities from Madrid to London to Boston. We have a problem with France. But part of the problem might be how hard it is for us to credit them with any sense as a normal nation with its own core interests and its own stock of knowledge, some of which may be of value. Well, let me conclude with just a few words about the contemporary period. The end of President Bush's term seemed to coincide with a reorientation of French foreign policy under President Nicolas Sarkozy, the Gaullist, then continuing under President François Hollande, the socialist. Sarkozy, of course, notably rejoined NATO's integrated command structure in 2009 and then pressured the United States to help overthrow Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. Hollande has called for intervention in Syria and was quick to send French troops into Mali to suppress a rebel movement that was flourishing in part thanks to Gaddafi's arsenal having flooded the black market, which is another sign that the French have no monopoly on foresight and reinforcing the law of unintended consequences. And all of that well before the current unraveling of Libya. Well, but all of these changes have led French scholar Pierre Gerlin to say that France has become more royalist than the king. by which he means more hawkish than the United States, and eager to cooperate. What caused this apparent realignment? There's a political explanation that has to do with Sarkozy's ambitions, but that doesn't explain the continuity with a different party in power. Guerlain says that it's Germany's rise that has made France now seek a closer relationship with the United States. Until 1990, France was the most important political and military force on the European continent. And it could punch above its weight in international affairs thanks to a process of European unification that had at its core that Franco-German rapprochement that de Gaulle had initiated, one that made France the rider on the German horse for several decades. That is, German economic power made Europe substantial, but Germany's post-war constraints against taking a leading role left European leadership by default to France, at least in a continental sense. Since the end of the Cold War, however, we've seen tectonic changes in Europe, not the least of which is the emergence of Germany as an international player, with precedent-setting military engagements in Kosovo and Afghanistan, and a large voice in global financial crises, and Angela Merkel now threading the needle of taking a leadership role in international diplomacy commensurate with Germany's size and importance, while not yet appearing to threaten anyone except a few people in Athens with a nightmare of a return to Germany's historical belligerence. We now know, to paraphrase Kissinger, what is Europe's phone number? It rings in Berlin. So Germany's increasing legitimacy in the international system is eclipsing the French post-war role. That may be causing this long-term, apparently structural change in French foreign policy and in its discursive strategy with the United States under both Sarkozy and Hollande. In substance, though, there is less to these changes than meets the eye. France has long been a medium-sized power with global ambitions, combining realism and idealism, evident in its autonomous nuclear deterrent, its veto in the UN Security Council, and its universalist language of human rights promotion. All of that is an old continuity. To be sure, rejoining NATO's integrated command structure after 43 years is significant. But Sarkozy did not do it in order to give up French independence. On the contrary, he did it to give France a seat at the table in NATO, especially because NATO is no longer just a Western alliance against Russian aggression, but seems to have become the alternative international institution planning military and peacekeeping missions in and well beyond Europe when the UN Security Council is deadlocked. And the notion that the French were doves, or effeminized weaklings, while the Americans were tough hawks, had always been a caricature. Sure, in 2002, House Majority Whip Roy Blunt could make the crack. Somebody was telling me about the French Army rifle being advertised on eBay the other day. The description said, "Never shot, dropped once." He too was angry that the French were threatening a veto in the Security Council. With friends like these, who needs enemies, right? But while Blunt was speaking, the French Air Force had joined the United States in flying missions against the Taliban, and French soldiers were at that very moment risking and sometimes losing their lives side by side with American troops. As an American officer in Kabul, after praising the courage of the French forces he worked with in the field, put it, "Out here, we've still got French fries." It may be time to stop thinking in terms of stereotype or historical debts. Lafayette and Yorktown don't require the US to do whatever France wants today, and Pershing and D-Day don't require France to do whatever the US wants tomorrow. Instead of pointing to national character flaws or debts of gratitude, what we see when we take the long view is that France has always been selective about its engagements, taking its wars à la carte, just as the United States has opted to stay out of various conflicts and actually shut down the Anglo-Franco-Israeli attack on Suez, on Egypt during the Suez crisis. It's not a French thing. It's a question of statecraft to make an assessment of the national interest and possible outcomes of intervention before making a decision. Since World War II, France frequently decided that its national interest called for sending troops in Indochina, Korea, Suez, Algeria, Western Sahara, Chad, Lebanon, First Gulf War, Bosnia, Cote d'Ivoire, Central African Republic, Kosovo, Afghanistan, all of that before Libya and Mali under Sarkozy and Hollande. Franco-American security cooperation continues in Africa, and as we speak, the French are arguably now the leading coalition partner of the United States in Iraq, conducting more airstrikes against ISIL than the British in an action that was authorized by the Iraqi government and sort of endorsed by the Security Council in September in a presidential statement with a lot of support, but no formal voted resolution. The French, you see, have nothing against unilateral crisis intervention or coalition operations with some form of international legitimacy. What they seem to have consistently argued against since de Gaulle is massive interventions and lasting occupations undertaken on a largely unilateral basis. Unilateral because the Allies have serious doubts about the consequences of the plan. As most people in this room are aware, increasing the number of participants in a decision makes it both more difficult to reach a decision and improves the legitimacy of the final decision reached. When it comes to war, both effects, a delay for careful consideration and increased international legitimacy once that decision is taken, may well be in America's interest when it comes to military action. Like it or not, the French have often cast themselves in the role not so much of junior partner as of the friend who asks whether you're really in shape to drive and offers you another way home. Maybe we can learn to listen to each other, because with friends like these, we may become more effective in developing strategies to protect the common interests of both countries, and if that means putting up with a certain level of annoyance, well, c'est la vie. Thank you. Be delighted to take your questions. Yes, sir.
I found your presentation all of it interesting, and I was very interested in the most recent part with the rise of Germany and France being more willing to cooperate with the United States as a result, maybe moving closer to the United States. That's what I heard from you. But nonetheless, Germany is getting more powerful. It has taken a hard line, some would say, towards Greece. And then you have the entire crisis in the Ukraine and the Crimea. So I was wondering, in your opinion, to whom is France closer, the United States or Germany? Or is it deferential to any one of these two powers more?
So I'm going to separate closer from deferential. And I'm going to emphasize that, even though you may not have meant anything by it, because it reminds me of what I've been reading in the archives about the way that Americans look at European affairs and the transatlantic alliance, which is to say, we expect that if they are close to us and supportive of us, they will be deferential. When you go back and read, by the way, to be fair to Kennedy and Johnson, they both were very upset at de Gaulle and told their people, don't talk about it in the press. They didn't want to provoke needlessly, they didn't want to egg him on, as it were, and make that tension even worse. However, when they tried to figure him out, and their advisors would discuss French policy, they would say things like, the natural position of the Europeans is to follow our lead on all questions. Well, okay, maybe so. I mean, if you're talking about states as billiard balls, or one of them is a bigger billiard ball, yeah, but that was not the perspective of anyone in Europe. So now, to get back to your question, my sense is that the French are still much closer with Germany than they are with the United States. That is a very deep and much more complicated and integrated working relationship, literally integrated in terms of EU institutions, and one that has weathered changes in party. Even when you have a socialist in Paris and a Christian Democrat in Berlin, or vice versa, those relations tend to be generally, especially on a working basis, very close. And we just saw as it turned out, not terribly successful in diplomatic initiative, but one that was done in coordination by Merkel and Hollande, even though they've offended each other in various ways and so forth. I don't know whether France is going to ever have to choose, but what seems clear is that at the moment we're living in a period of relative good relations between France and the United States. And one might almost ask, why'd you give that talk today? We're doing okay, they've got the carrier, right? They're helping us, things are good. And my point is that when you take the long view, things aren't going to be good forever. We're going to have a moment where there will be a division between France and the United States that erupts into the public sphere over a very important question of policy. And what I hope we'll do then is not to say, okay, what does Paris want? We'll do that. But not to go back to cheese-eating surrender monkeys, right? Not to go back to this notion that the French have lost every war they ever fought, which also isn't true, right? Not to go back to the notion that the French are, that they're effeminized. You find that in the records too. It's terrible looking at how Kennedy and Johnson talked about the French, and it's also terrible to see how they talked about women in general. Anyway, so the point is that I think that the closeness of the relations now offers an opportunity to develop better patterns so that when things go badly, we will be in a position to try to assess dispassionately what their interests and advice are worth.
And if I might follow up to your answer, what is the cause of this anti-French American attitude, do you think? Is it the fact that we're from England and that England and France have always been hostile? Is it because our leaders often seem rather ignorant, like President Ford saying in the presidential debate that it would be a surprise to the people of, I think, Czechoslovakia that they're communist, in Poland, which even though they were clearly communists at the time, but it never seemed to have occurred to them. And that's okay for the people at our top levels. I'm offering some of my theories.
Good, yeah, and I like those. Not so much the ignorant of the leadership, although, to be fair, generalists rise to the top, right? Specialists get stuck in the middle, filing their reports. And so often when you pick country X, if it happens to be France, you're going to have a lot of people at the very top who really don't know that much about it, but still have to make rapid decisions and have to be decisive and don't have time to read all of those reports that some of you are writing. So that's part of it is the question of, we're a big country dealing with the whole world, so we don't know that, our top leaders don't know that much about any given country. However, the Franco-American tension is very interesting in both directions. And by the way, if you want to call disapproval of the United States or annoyance at the United States anti-Americanism, I actually wrote a whole book disputing that that's what it is, which I can recommend to you, Rethinking Anti-Americanism. But if we want to look at opinion polls, that kind of thing, the French are more negative towards the United States than other Europeans are. So what is the source of this tension? There's a very nice, almost Freudian analysis of it that says we never worked it out with a war. We fought wars with all our other important allies, right? And beat them, and so now we can all get along, right? We haven't worked that out with the French, so that's one theory. As a historian, I'm actually more sympathetic to the argument of clashing universalisms. That is to say, there are a lot of countries on the earth that think they're the best, maybe all of them. There are a few countries in history that have thought, not only are we the best, but we have the recipe for human society that should be imitated by everybody else. That's us, right? We have the perfect model, city on the hill, etc. That's the French. It was the Soviets for a period, that have this notion that they have a universal response that all other countries and cultures should follow and adopt. Well, the French have their version and we have a different version, and even though we both are relatively democratic and so forth, those are in competition. And then I also agree with what you said, not only that the long, 1,000-year-old rivalry and sometimes enmity between France and Great Britain got transferred onto Great Britain's child, but also, along with that, we inherited language, culture, political institutions, a lot of other things that are Anglo. And so when the French talk about their problem with the United States, they'll often talk about les Anglo-Saxons and put both Anglo-Saxons, right, and put both Britain and the United States in the same category when describing their resentments. Frankly, as you can tell from my talk, I don't think the French have earned our derision of them, and a lot of it is based on stereotype and silly stuff, and some of it is based on the very different lived historical experience of these cataclysmic events in world history. In World War I, there was some argument afterwards in the 20s about the merchants of death and how the banks and the munitions makers got us into it. But generally speaking, we rode to the rescue and saved the day, right? D-Day, same story. For the French, when de Gaulle articulated, he said, well, thanks a lot, but why did it take you so long? You sat over there while we were occupied. Well, there was also the Vichy collaboration and so forth, which is why, again, where you stand depends on where you sit. I think the point is that we don't have to resolve this and decide who's right. Of course, neither one is right. The question is, can we work with our allies? And they're difficult to work with. Okay, maybe not as difficult as the Pakistanis, right? I don't know if it's our most frustrating ally nowadays, but let's say in the long range, over time, our most frustrating ally. And I think that on both sides, there would be a lot of benefit to be had from treating one another as normal nations, recognizing that other countries have core interests too, and have their own stock of knowledge and historical experience, and then trying to assess that and ultimately reaching the decision that best suits us. Yes, sir.
Pardon the fog of this memory, but in the run-up to the war in Iraq, it seemed like, I may have gotten bad journalism at some point, but that there was collaboration between France and Iraq or Iran. You didn't mention it, so I wondered.
Collaboration with Iraq. Oh, well, so the Franco-American, and if anybody in this room has particular expertise on this question, I would like to defer and invite you to add what you know if you worked on that particular brief. But there was French commercial and military ties to Iraq going back a long ways, as well as some now famous versions of US support for Saddam during his war with Iran, right down to providing precursors for chemical weapons and other ugly parts of our past. And during the oil for food program, there were also French companies that profited from Iraqi oil. My assessment when looking at that is that that doesn't explain why the French didn't want us to go to war. If the French had been all about material profits for France in the conflict with Iraq, they would have jumped right on board to get the contracts afterwards. Chirac recognized that whatever he might have had going with Iraq beforehand, if he was seen as the world's leading opponent of the war that the Americans clearly were going ahead with anyway, he could write off any possible, he could expect to write off any possible participation afterwards, right? Punish France. So if the French ties to Iraq that existed are to be seen as the factor explaining France's opposition to the war, then they were not foresighted. They're not gifted with foresight and were cutting off their nose to spite their face. Other questions? Yes, please.
I believe it was in the fall of 2003, I was able to hear the French ambassador to the United States give a talk. And I cannot recall a specific phrase that he used, but he seemed to imply that the French government was okay with, and that's probably not a good term, but with the American invasion of Iraq, as long as the United States did not go back to the Security Council and force them to take a vote. They believed that the previous resolutions were okay, and that the United States was forced because of concerns in Britain and the Parliament that they had to. And so it seemed like a lose-lose situation. Am I misreading what that ambassador?
Well, he gave a number of speeches, and I'm not sure which one in particular. And I want to go back to the sources as we tend to do, because we don't have to work as fast as you people. But the short answer is that the French position was that with a UN Security Council endorsement, that would provide the necessary legitimacy, but they were going to block it. So the idea that the French were supportive of the war as long as they didn't have to sign on to it, I don't know that that fits with this very public campaign that included Villepin's dramatic speech at the UN arguing against the war, that if what you've just described was said, it would seem to be an outlier in a policy in a policy initiative that otherwise was pretty consistent. Okay.
We're at the end of our hour. Perhaps if there are a few more questions,
Happy to stay for a few minutes.
stay. But I'd like to thank you for coming and token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Another round of applause.
Thank you all for coming.